After Constantine died, the empire did not receive peace. It received fear, suspicion, and a throne surrounded by blood across the imperial world. Julian's story begins inside that violence, among relatives who learned that imperial family could be deadlier than enemies around the throne. When Constantine's sons inherited power, most male relatives of the dead emperor were massacred inside the imperial capital itself after Constantine's passing. The crime was never fully explained, but many believed Constantius had ordered it, or at least allowed it in fearful whispers. Julian would carry that accusation for life, because the victims included his father, his uncle, and his older brother before he became emperor. In his memory, the Christian emperor's house smelled not of holiness, but of betrayal, calculation, and guarded silence behind palace doors. Only Julian and his half-brother Gallus survived, probably because they were too young and politically harmless. Julian later believed Gallus was spared because he seemed seriously ill, while Julian was spared because he was still a child. Constantius may have thought two frightened boys could not challenge a throne defended by soldiers, bishops, and court officials. But the children who survive a massacre often remember more than rulers expect, especially when faith remains closely tied to power. For Julian, Christianity was never only doctrine. It was bound to a court where relatives vanished without trial. The future apostate was formed not by pagan triumph, but by a Christian empire that looked terrifying from within as a boy. After the slaughter, Julian and Gallus were kept far from court, where their memories could not become political weapons. Both boys received Christian instruction, were baptized, and even served as readers in the church during their guarded youth under watchful control. Yet the faith surrounding Julian came through tutors chosen by the same regime that had destroyed his family and his future enemies. Gallus turned toward physical exercise and rough discipline, while Julian withdrew into books, questions, and the dangerous beauty of ancient thought. Under supervision, Julian learned Christian language, but his imagination increasingly belonged to philosophers, poets, and the older gods of Greece deeply. The more Constantius used Christianity as imperial order, the more Julian searched for freedom in another world. This does not mean Julian was simple or foolish. He was intelligent, wounded, disciplined, and deeply hungry for meaning. He saw pagan tradition not as empty ritual, but as a lost inheritance waiting to be defended and renewed. Meanwhile, Gallus was brought back into politics when Constantius needed an heir and appointed him Caesar in 351. Gallus received authority in the east, but he proved unstable, suspicious, and severe, creating fear instead of loyalty across the eastern court. Accusations followed him quickly, and his failure deepened Constantius's fears about ambitious relatives who stood near imperial power inside the palace. Eventually, Constantius had Gallus arrested and beheaded, leaving Julian both vulnerable and valuable as the last surviving useful cousin in the dynasty. Julian watched this from within the same system that had spared him, educated him, and now seemed ready to use him. His childhood had taught him that imperial favor could save a life while quietly preparing the next danger. Julian was sent to Athens, the city of old wisdom, where Christian memory competed with classical beauty within his imagination and memory. There he knew Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus, future bishops who would later read his life with alarm. Athens gave Julian more than education. It gave him an imaginative homeland where philosophy, ritual, and ancient gods seemed alive again. He became fascinated with mystery religions and convinced that truth lived in the older, hidden traditions of classical Greece against Christian teaching. By then, he had definitively abandoned Christianity, not merely as a system of belief, but as a world he distrusted. When Constantius needed help in the West, he unexpectedly made Julian Caesar and sent him to Gaul after Gallus had failed. No one expected much from the scholar prince, but Julian soon proved disciplined, courageous, and astonishingly effective in command during Gaul's frontier crisis. His campaigns against the Germanic tribes won soldiers' loyalty and gave him the popularity Constantius had feared from the beginning. Julian was not yet emperor, but the army began seeing in him a ruler who could restore order and victory. Constantius, preparing war against Persia, ordered Julian's troops eastward, and the soldiers rebelled by proclaiming Julian Augustus before the empire watched. The empire now faced a civil war between two cousins, but before they clashed, Constantius died unexpectedly in 361. Julian entered Constantinople as sole emperor, convinced that fate had preserved him for a pagan restoration against Christian imperial rule itself. But his future struggle would not be fought only by the sword. It would begin with religion education, and Rome's memory. That opening wound will explain why Julian later attacked Christianity without formally ordering a general persecution. Julian's first act was to seek revenge against those he blamed for his misfortunes and family tragedy. Private vengeance became policy. He spoke of justice, but behind that justice stood the memory of a child who had survived palace slaughter. Trust weakened. Several enemies were condemned to death, and the new ruler immediately showed that he could act with severity. The church remembered. Yet Julian was not merely a man of revenge. He became an able administrator of a vast, exhausted empire. Memory sharpened. He restored order in chaotic administration, reduced court luxury, and tried to bring discipline back into government. The reform unsettled everyone. His reign was brief, but contemporaries saw that he was not an empty dreamer or a weak scholar. The stakes grew. History remembered him chiefly, not for administration, but for the religious program that gave him the name Apostate. The empire watched. He wanted to restore the lost glory of paganism, which he believed the Christian empire had nearly extinguished. The church remembered. Since Constantine's time, the ancient cults had lost splendor, money, public attention, and confidence. Imperial culture now stood in open question. Some temples stood almost empty, while priests struggled to maintain poor ceremonies with miserable resources. Victory now carried unexpected political burdens. Julian decided that the ancient faith had to be not merely protected, but completely rebuilt and revived. Restoration entered public view. Thus began an attempt to turn history backward, using the tools of an empire that had learned from Christians. Trust weakened. Julian wanted to restore pagan temples to their property, status, and former place in imperial life. The wound stayed politically open, but he understood that a command was not enough if people no longer believed in the old rites. Culture mattered deeply. Therefore, he planned not simple restoration, but a reform of paganism, modeled partly on the organized church. The policy drew attention. Each province was to have chief priests, subordinate to a supreme priesthood centered on Julian himself. The stakes now sharpened visibly. This resembled the church's episcopal structure, although Julian hated the very victory of Christianity. Religious policy now reached across every province. He demanded moral seriousness from pagan priests, care for worship, and attention to the poor. Even imitation confessed Christianity's public influence. There was deep irony here. While rejecting Christianity, Julian borrowed much from its strength. Public loyalty now carried a religious cost. He saw that the church conquered not only by doctrine, but by community, discipline, and mercy. The church understood the danger, so he ordered pagan ministers to live honorably and become examples for the people. Every province now felt the religious pressure. For Julian, religion had to become the heart of public order, as it had been in ancient Rome. The empire watched. He believed the empire had weakened because it had turned away from the gods of its ancestors. Cultural pressure now mattered. The return of the cults was meant not as private devotion, but as national medicine for a wounded state. Memory sharpened. He reopened temples, restored sacrifices, and called cities to honor the ancient festivals again. Imperial unity now required religious choices daily. Yet the program, imagined as renewal, required money, animals, priests, and real participation from ordinary people. The policy carried real danger. Julian could issue decrees, yet human hearts would not learn to love ancient rites on command. Love remained beyond legislation. Here lay the weakness of the whole restoration. It was one emperor's energy more than a people's movement. The church remembered. He was sincere, educated, and persistent, but sincerity does not always create a living religion. Ordinary life absorbed the conflict. Many ordinary people mocked his excessive ceremonies because they seemed strange, burdensome, and out of step with daily life. Christians noticed. Christians saw in this reform not spiritual awakening, but an attempt to drag the world backward. The court sensed deeper danger. Thus, Julian's new pagan policy immediately became a struggle not only over rights, but over the future. The policy touched everyone. To show the seriousness of his return to the ancient gods, Julian personally participated in rites. Old injuries shaped public culture. Under his orders, enormous sacrifices were offered, sometimes hundreds of animals during a single religious festival. Unresolved tensions came back sharply. For him, this was the restoration of ancient holiness. For many witnesses, it looked like strange excess. The spectacle divided opinion. Even pagans did not always rejoice at such zeal, because the habits of the empire had already changed. The stakes grew. Ceremonies meant to inspire the empire sometimes gave opponents material for mockery and tired conversation. Christian confidence faced a new test. Julian did not want to be only paganism's patron. He wanted to be its example and chief servant. The church remembered. That image distinguished him from Constantius, but it also made him vulnerable to ridicule. The whole empire now watched religious allegiance. An emperor too absorbed in sacrificial details seemed to some less like a ruler than a priest. The emperor overreached spiritually, but this was how Julian understood power. The ruler must lead the people toward the gods. The restoration now faced resistance. He believed that without restored sacred order, no army and no laws would save the empire. Sacred order now governed policy. In that sense, Julian was a reaction against the Christian empire, but not merely its shadow. Culture itself remained contested there. He offered an alternative sacred history, in which Rome was supposed to belong again to the old gods. Culture mattered deeply. That is why his policy was more dangerous than a simple taste for old ceremonies. The triumph now revealed hidden costs. It tried to offer the empire a different answer to the question of who governs history. The crisis grew more public. It is important to say clearly, Julian did not issue a general decree persecuting Christians. Christian learning now faced imperial pressure. There were martyrs in some places, but their deaths did not result from a direct imperial command. Schools became battlefields too. Sometimes the cause was local officials' zeal. Sometimes it was a crowd exploiting the new atmosphere. Earlier conflicts resurfaced differently now. Julian himself was convinced that open persecution of Christians would only help their cause. State power now entered spiritual memory directly. He knew that the blood of martyrs in the past had made the church stronger, not weaker. Memory shaped his restraint. Therefore, his strategy was subtler. Hinder Christianity, ridicule it, and deprive it of cultural influence. The church faced a different trial. He did not want to create new heroes whom the church could glorify after his death. Ancient memory resisted imperial repair. Instead, he wanted to make Christians appear ridiculous, uneducated, and gradually deprived of public authority. Social ridicule became a weapon. This was not softness, but another form of struggle, colder and more cultural. Still, ancient loyalties now confronted Christian confidence openly. Julian understood that empire rests not only on soldiers, but also on schools, memory, and language. The question cut deeper now. That is why his attack on Christians began not with arenas, but with classical literature. Believers encountered a colder battlefield now. He decided to strike those who taught the words through which the empire's elite thought and spoke. Mockery became imperial policy. The first powerful blow was a law forbidding Christians to teach classical literature. Still, Christian confidence now met pagan ambition empire-wide. For Julian, this seemed logical. One could not hate Homer's gods while teaching Homer. Every city now carried this religious tension. He considered it sacrilege that Christians used the great books of antiquity to spread their faith. The pressure became unmistakably public. Since the 2nd century, apologists had used classical culture to speak with educated pagans. Public worship now became an imperial question. Now Julian tried to take that bridge to the educated world away from the church. Cultural bridges now became imperial battlegrounds. Christian teachers had to abandon their profession or betray their own faith in the emperor's eyes. The past demanded another answer. This law shed no blood, but it struck the future of church leaders and Christian learning. The church understood the danger. Without schools, Christians could be cut off from the language by which the empire was governed. Every answer carried public risk. In effect, Julian said, "If you reject our gods, do not use our culture." Roman identity now demanded religious definition again. For Christians, this was dangerous because their faith had long spoken the educated empire's language. Educated language became a contested inheritance. Julian's law tried to make the church intellectually foreign in a world where it had recently become visible. Culture mattered deeply. Thus, instead of executions, a new pressure appeared: deny Christians the right to interpret civilization's shared language. Pressure moved into classrooms. Yet this blow did not stop the church. It forced it to seek new ways of speaking. Christian speech adapted, quietly. Julian opened a front where words became weapons no less than legions. After all, old rites now challenged Christian public confidence. Julian's second line of attack was ridicule. He called Christians not Christians, but Galileans. Faith and culture now collided across provinces. He tried to shrink their name, as if their faith were a local superstition, not truth for the empire. Memory sharpened. For this purpose, he wrote Against the Galileans, a work directed against the Bible and the teaching of Jesus. Christians noticed. The work itself was lost, but its influence was strong enough that Cyril of Alexandria later wrote a rebuttal. It mattered. Cyril admitted that part of Julian's power came from his knowledge of Christianity from within. The future of teaching felt threatened. Julian knew the Bible, church language, and weak points in arguments, because he had grown inside them. Public language became contested. One of his main arguments claimed that Christians had twisted and misread the Jewish scriptures. Scripture now entered public argument. He argued that if the scriptures belonged to the Jews, Christians had no right to read them against Judaism. Christians noticed. By this, he tried to deprive the church of the foundation by which it explained Christ and history. The stakes grew. He mocked the Bible's contents, the teaching of Jesus, and the Christian claim to fulfill prophecy. Mockery carried administrative consequences there. For Christians, his mockery was especially painful because it came from someone who knew their sacred words. Education became spiritual warfare. But Julian did not stop with a book. He tried to set history itself against Christians. Old fears entered new arguments. He decided to rebuild the Jerusalem temple, not from any particular affection for Judaism itself. Success now opened unsettling spiritual questions. The main aim was to refute the Christian argument that the temple's destruction had fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. The stakes grew. If the temple were rebuilt, he thought, Christians would lose one of their strongest proofs. Cultural survival became a Christian question. Thus, his struggle became not merely administrative, but a theological attack on the Christian understanding of time. Memory shaped political conflict. Julian sought to show Christian history was wrong, and that the ancient world could still return. The memory endured. But his plans moved faster than the years, politics, and the emperor's own mortality allowed. Imperial favor now demanded careful discernment. All Julian's projects were moving rapidly when war suddenly pulled his attention away from internal policy. He led troops against the Persians, seeking to prove his strength not only in religion, but in battle. For the soldiers, he remained a successful commander, a man who had already earned their trust in Gaul. But the Persian campaign was risky, and Julian's vast ambitions collided with the harsh reality of the East. Supply became difficult, the terrain hostile, and the emperor's decisions increasingly resembled a race against time. At the decisive moment, Julian was fatally wounded by an enemy spear during battle. Legend claims that he died with the blasphemous words, "You have conquered, Galilean." Still, a historian must be careful. We cannot prove with certainty that he truly spoke those words. But the legend shows how Christians understood his death as the defeat of the last great challenge. Julian wanted to turn the empire backward, but his life ended before the project could take root. His death revealed how deeply the whole program depended on one mind, one will, and one throne. When the emperor disappeared, pagan restoration almost immediately lost its central engine. After all, Christians survived not because they were already secure, but because their enemy proved mortal. Yet the question Julian raised did not disappear with him. In the Christian empire, Julian failed not because he was a foolish opponent or a weak ruler, too. He was educated, energetic, personally devoted to his cause, and capable of governing people. But he tried to resurrect a religious world whose social energy had already greatly weakened. By then, Christianity was no longer a small sect that could be displaced by mockery or a school law. It possessed martyr memory, habits of communal life, and a language capable of speaking to the educated. Most importantly, it had already learned how to survive power, even when power became hostile. Julian wanted to strip the church of imperial patronage, yet its inner life remained beyond his reach. His policy also revealed that paganism could not simply become what it had been before. To compete with the church, it had to borrow structure, discipline, and charity from the church. This meant that even in attacking Christianity, Julian was recognizing its strength in practice. He could not simply destroy the church, so he tried to build a pagan church against it. But a copy rarely produces the same life when the people's heart has already changed. Therefore, Julian's reign became the last great attempt of the pagan world to recover initiative. It was intelligent, energetic, sometimes dangerous, but too dependent on one life. In practice, when that life ended, Christianity again proved stronger than a political reversal, after all. Yet victory did not mean the church would face no more dangers after Constantine. The danger changed. Christians now had to understand how to live with power and against power. Julian failed, but his question about memory, culture, and loyalty would remain alive. Still, for Christian writers, Julian's death became proof that Christ had defeated the last pagan reaction. They remembered him not as an able administrator, but as the apostate who challenged the Lord. Thus, Julian's story became a warning that education without humility can become war against truth. But the historian must also see the other side. Julian was not a random madman, but a serious opponent. His attack was dangerous precisely because he understood the church better than many pagans. He saw its schools, charity, structure, and power of memory, so he struck at those places. He did not try to repeat Diocletian because he knew direct persecution could create new martyrs. Instead, he tried to make Christianity culturally helpless, socially ridiculous, and theologically implausible too. Yet the church survived not only the sword, but also this subtler ridicule. Still, this matters for our whole story. Christianity conquered empire not only by resisting death. It also survived cultural pressure, educated mockery, and the attempt to take away elite language. Julian hoped to demonstrate the ancient empire could live without Christ and against Christ. But his brief reign showed the opposite. The new reality had already changed the world too deeply. After him, paganism still existed, but it could no longer recover its former central power. The church entered a new age, where the main test would no longer be only external enemies. He would have to ask again how faithfulness can survive when victory brings temptations. And that theme will lead us onward, into new conflicts inside the victorious Christian world. Because after Julian, the question changes. Not whether the church can win, but what victory will do to it. Julian's reaction was new, precisely because it rarely needed theatrical brutality to be dangerous. It worked through schools, books, temple offices, civic ceremonies, and public honor. In practice, a Christian might not face an executioner, yet still feel slowly pushed out of the world. Julian showed that persecution could be not only bloody, but also intellectual in practice. He wanted Christians to lose respect before they lost freedom in the Christian empire. If the church became uneducated, laughable, and foreign to classical culture, its voice would weaken. But the church already carried a memory that no school order could cancel, too. Its strength did not rest only on imperial privileges that Julian could remove. Still, it lived in homes, habits, bishops' letters, Sunday gatherings, and shared hope, after all. Therefore, Julian struck at culture, but encountered a community deeper than culture, in practice. This made his struggle historically important even after his reign disappeared, as history shows. He failed, but he identified the weak points of the new Christian age very clearly. Julian's greatest enemy was not only Christianity, but time itself, which cannot be turned backward. He could restore altars, yet the old world around those altars would not return. He could order priests toward moral discipline, yet public trust could not be manufactured instantly. He could open temples, yet empty steps would not instantly become the city's heart again. He could argue against the Bible, yet lived Christian experience remained difficult to erase. He could mock the Galileans, but mockery does not easily break those who have already faced death. Yet Julian was dangerous because he understood that culture shapes future generations. After all, his teaching ban struck not today's sermon, but tomorrow's teachers, for the coming centuries. His polemic against Scripture struck not church walls, but the meaning of history, too. His Jerusalem Temple project was an attempt to argue with Christians through stones. Still, therefore, Julian's short reign was not an episode, but a test of the whole post-Constantinian church. It had to learn whether its faith rested on power or on a deeper foundation. The answer became clearer after Julian's death than during his reforms, as history shows. The church remained, while his restoration became a memory of the last attempt to turn empire backward. After Julian, Christianity no longer feared that paganism could easily reclaim the empire. Still, but that did not mean the Christian world entered a calm and simple age. Victory over an external opponent opened new questions about power, culture, and faithfulness. Still, if the church could survive Julian, could it also survive its own influence too? Could it speak to culture without becoming a prisoner of culture under Julian's rule? Could it use imperial protection without turning faith into a state custom, after all? Julian tried to prove Christian victory was only a temporary mistake within history, but the church remained. Instead, he showed that Christianity had become too deep to disappear by command. But he also showed that culture remains a battlefield even after the martyrs have won. The following centuries would prove this again. The struggle for empire became a struggle for meaning. At the center of that struggle remained the question Julian unintentionally sharpened. In practice, who defines the future? Emperor, philosopher, priest, bishop, or the crucified Galilean, after all? Julian died quickly, but that question would continue sounding throughout the history of the Christian empire. The next test will show that the victorious church must learn not only to survive, but to govern itself. Julian's failure would remain a warning about how culture, memory, and power can become weapons. Christianity had survived the apostate emperor, but it still had to learn what faithful victory required. The next struggle would show that power can protect the church, yet also tempt it to forget the cross before the empire. And so Julian's defeat becomes not merely an ending, but a doorway into the harder history of Christian rule in empire.